Yeah, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session. So this is very good, getting up at this early hour after the party last night. So has anyone got a hangover? Nobody? Or maybe it's everybody and you just didn't hear my question. Anyway, welcome to the session. And as I say, what I want to do with this session is really look at how we deploy the ADFS infrastructure. So it's not going to be about sort of setting up claim rules and relationships with other parties. It's getting that core piece of infrastructure in place and the decisions we made. Because one of the questions I want to sort of really ask you is, do you need ADFS? All right? And that's something I'd like you to take away from the session and just question yourselves as to exactly why you're doing ADFS. Do you need it? Is there other ways of solving and getting what you need? And, but we'll go through all the various options. So my mouse has gone to sleep. That's better. So first of all, I'm just going to cover off what's new in the ADFS for Server 2012 R2. And by the way, if you look on the internet, you'll see people referring to ADFS 3. I had it from the product group. Officially, it is not ADFS 3. It is ADFS running on Server 2012 R2, right? Which is much easier to say. So we won't mention ADFS 3 again. So reasons to deploy. I want to look at the architecture. I want to look at the architecture for the deployment, installing ADFS, and then installing the web application proxy. And really what I want to do is just go through all the decision points and what we've got to consider in terms of certificates and so on. So in terms of what's new in ADFS version 3, sorry, ADFS running on Server 2012 R2, is it's now installed as a role. Previously, it was installed as a role, but it's not the one you installed because that bit didn't work. So you had to go and download ADFS. It uses HTTPSYS and not IIS. And that's a combination of performance reasons and also security reasons. One of the objections, and this was Microsoft's view of trying to make things simpler, you could run ADFS on a domain controller, right? However, people said, well, hang on, for years you've told us not to install IIS on a domain controller from a security perspective. So how can you possibly tell us that we can run ADFS on a domain controller? And so what's happened now is there is no IIS, it's using HTTPSYS. So probably the same vulnerabilities with A, but you don't see them. But the idea of why did they want you to run it on a domain controller, it was to try and make it simpler when you were doing federation with Office 365. You know, and in some ways, it sort of makes sense putting it on domain controller because it's an Active Directory federation services. So it's one of the services of Active Directory. Anyway, for a sort of real deployment, certainly I would not be running it on a domain controller. It's installed in a different directory now, and it's in the Windows directory under ADFS. And the reason I mention that is there's a couple of config files in there. One is for ADFS itself, one is for the federated services, and one is for the device registration services. And if you need to turn on some additional logging, so if you do some customization, you want to turn on trace logging, that's the place you do it. So go into Windows ADFS and have a look for the config files in there. If you want additional logging, you want to change parameters, how long the proxy ticket remains, or the proxy certificate remains valid, and so on. It supports for additional claims, including device claims. So now we can, if you came to the session yesterday, you can do things like workplace join, do device authentication, and then we can base our decisions in terms of authorization on things about the device. So, you know, if it's an iPad, deny access. You know, if it's a Windows device, allow access. So you can make those sort of decisions now. And there's support for global and per-relying party authentication policies. And authentication is about the method of authentication that we use. So you can say, if you're coming from an unregistered device, you must use multi-factor authentication. And that multi-factor authentication could be phone factor, it could be using certificates. And those authentication policies can be based on location. Is the device inside the corporate network? Is it outside? To be able to tell whether it's inside or outside, what we need is the web application proxy. So if we're outside the web application proxy, we'll have one claim. If we're inside the web application proxy, we'll have a different claim. And we can make the decision inside, outside, device type, and also group membership. So it's much more customizable than it used to be, including the addition of multi-factor authentication providers. So Microsoft out the box will give you certificates for the second factor. You can use the Microsoft phone factor, multi-factor server, which you can install as an extension of ADFS. And then there's lots of third-party solutions as well. There's no standalone setup now, so if you're testing this in a test lab and you want a very simple install, you simply just do a single farm member. I mean, it was a bit of a strange one having a standalone server install, because as soon as you wanted to try something else, like, well, we need a farm, you had to sort of start again. Whereas now that option's gone if you've ever tried it. You've got this thing called the device registration service built in, and this is for doing workplace joins. So this is where we join a device into our infrastructure. And there's a web application proxy, which is going to sit on our edge. It does the proxying for ADFS, plus we can publish applications out through the proxy to the internet. And there's a number of options for publishing. Number one, what we can do is simply publish it. We come in through the proxy. It does its proxy thing through to the app, and then we do the authentication on the app. We can also publish with pre-authentication, in which case we come in. You have to get through into corporate network, you have to authenticate. That has to be claims-based. And then we go through to the application. And the final one is we come in with a claims identity, authenticate at the edge, and go out with a Windows identity using Kerberos constrained delegation. So those are the sort of new options which came with Server 2012 R2. So I just want to do some key concepts. So when we're talking about things, you know what I'm talking about and why I'm focusing on a particular aspect. So this slide you will have seen before. I use it quite often just to get over the key messages. We've got our user. Our user is going to access application X. So the first thing is the user goes to a security token service and says, please authenticate me and give me a token for application X. We then have a token issued for application X, which is digitally signed by the security token service. And that is received by application X, and application X accepts it as proof of authentication of the user. Why does it prove the user's authenticated? Well, the user just sent it to me, plus it's digitally signed by the security token service. And what goes on the security token service is, or the security ticket or security token, is entirely up to you. You decide what claims go on there. As a minimum set of claims, it will be the fact you're authenticated and the authentication time. Right? Beyond that, as part of your ADFS rules, you decide what claims you put on there. How do you make that decision? It's based on how you want to authorize access to the application. In terms of the flow, and this is important to understanding our sort of design structure and how we lay and use ADFS, our client will hit the claims aware application, and that's how it starts off. So it goes to a URL, hits the claims aware application. The claims aware application says you're not authenticated, and it gives you a redirect sending you up to the security token service. And part of that redirect will actually instruct the security token service to log the person on for this particular application, and return a security token. So authentication will take place, and that authentication could be against the local AD. And by the way, I should say now, ADFS, as its current version, will only authenticate against an AD. What you can do is you can send the user up to another security token service and get it to authenticate up there. But in terms of actually going against an identity store, it will only go against AD. Now, a previous version of ADFS would also go against a lightweight directory, an LDAP store. And it doesn't happen in this one. But the next release, LDAP as an identity store will be back. So watch out for the next wave release, which is probably going to be 2016 now, maybe server 2016. So we get back our security token, and we send that token back to the Claims Aware app, and the Claims Aware app lets us in. So that's the basic flow. There are different protocols. So there's WS Federation, there's SAML-P, there's now OAuth 2, which is becoming very popular. And the flows are slightly different, however, the principles are the same. If we're working with another IDP, what will happen is we hit the web, says you're not authenticated, redirects you to the security token service that web application trusts. All right? And then that web app, the security token service can say, well, hang on a minute. I trust the AD, and I trust this partner, and I trust this partner, and I trust this partner. So we got 3 partners and an AD. So what we need to do is find out what the home realm is. So we do this thing called home realm discovery. Right? And if you use the home realm discovery out of the box with ADFS, what you'll have is a list of all of the other identity providers that your ADFS server trusts. And that you probably don't want. So if you're designing the system so that you're federating with multiple partners, you're going to have to customize the home realm discovery, because you probably don't want one customer seeing that you trust, the XYZ company, the ABC company, the LMG company. Oh, that's that partner's enemy. All right, so you don't want to declare that. So what you probably want to do, and one of the simplest ways of doing this, is you customize the page and you gather the person's email. So rather than the person choosing the identity provider to go off to, which is the default, you gather their email and then you look it up and you match their email to their home realm. But we choose the home realm and the home realm discovery, and then we get a redirect up to the home realm security token service. And if it got really complicated, that guy could also do home realm discovery and send you off somewhere else. There's a potential infinite chain here that you could do. But we'll say that this guy authenticates you against the AD, produces a security token, and that security token is populated with claims, not for the application, because that guy doesn't know anything about the application. What he knows is about the other security token service. So he populates with claims for this security token service. So that token goes back to our security token service. Our security token service now accepts that as proof of authentication of the user. There may be some claims they want to use, and they process those claims further. They add their own claims and then produce a token which is to be consumed by the application. And so we send it back to the app. So these are the 2 main scenarios that you may be deploying ADFS for. So what I want to do is actually look at the reasons for deploying. So you may have an application which is a claims-aware application. You've decided to go claims-aware app, and in some way they make a huge amount of sense, because if you think of a normal Windows auth app, basically you're throwing a very large Kerberos token at that app. And that app may well have to go off and access an HR database and this database and that database. And it may want nothing off that token, so Kerberos token at all. All it wants is a little bit of information about the user. Well, if you go claims, you can populate the token that's passed to the app with the appropriate claims about the user. And then the app doesn't have to go anywhere to get that information. It's already there. So it's sort of stopping reinventing the wheel, you know, every single app having to access the HR database and all the rest of it. So it really potentially simplifies authorization to services. So that might be a reason. If you want to do that, you need your own ADFS, right? Your own ADFS, probably into your own AD as the identity store. So that's one scenario. Having said that, do we need to use our own ADFS, or could we use a cloud service? And I'll come back on that in a second. The next scenario is where we've got the same thing. We've got your users, but we've also got external users. So how are we going to authorize external users to gain access to our applications? Well, we've just gone through the flow for that one. So the external user hits our web app, redirects up to our STS. Our STS says, well, you know, I trust all these different federated partners, and we do the home run discovery, and we actually go up to a partner STS. So again, that's another scenario where you've got two organizations, both capable of actually doing federated sign-on. So we've got our own STS, which could well be ADFS. We've got the partner, all right, which may be ADFS, or there may be some other stack they're using. And we can integrate the two together because of the industry standard protocols that are used. Having said that, it sounds really simple. Sometimes it's unbelievably complex working with a partner to get the integration. I've worked on a lot of integrations between sort of one company and another company, and invariably it's sort of very long phone calls while you work out what you're both doing wrong. And of course, nobody will admit that they're doing something wrong. So miraculously, quite often, you know, you say, well, are you doing this? Oh, of course we're doing this. And then when you have a break, and then, oh, look, it started working. That's strange, isn't it? You know. So that's another scenario. And the claims-aware application itself, where is it? It could be on your premises, or it could be in the cloud. So what you could do is you could publish your claims-aware application in the cloud, and when somebody hits that, it comes back to your ADFS on premises, or you could publish it in the cloud, and you could go to a cloud security token service of some kind. So here's another one. We're published up in the cloud, and they're this time, but it's third-party services. They've got their own STS. And what we want to do is we want our users to authenticate against that. So this time, the cloud security token service is trusting the on-premises security token service. Resource STS is a very common scenario we use. You've got, if we're thinking about it just in terms of your own organization, you might have an enterprise STS service in your organization, and that's the one that does the authentication against the AD. And then we've got, in different parts of the organization, in different business units, we have applications, right? Those applications being claims aware as well. So what we can do is we can actually have, so we got relying party 1, relying party 2 there, with a trust relationship to one security token service. And then relying party 3 and relying party 4 have a trust relationship to another security token service. And what it does, it allows the business units to control the claims that are generated for those applications. So if you like, who knows about authorization to those apps? It's the business units because they own the apps. So let them control the final claims that control access to the apps. And then those guys trust your enterprise security token service. And the enterprise security token service is purely about, you know, authenticating someone, probably giving a minimal claim set, which then is augmented by the business unit security token service. So that's another scenario. And then there's the question of user profile data, right? So here, you may go up and you may authenticate against a security token service which gives really minimal information about a user. And for instance, if you go up and you authenticate against a Microsoft account, or what it used to be called is Live ID, right? All you get is a number back for the user. You don't get their username. You do not get even their email address. And now we've got an immutable number that always comes back. It's always the same when that user logs on to the Live ID account, but we know nothing about the user. So what you probably want to do is go and ask the user what their name is, what their email address is. So we're actually going to have to create a profile for that user locally. And that's something else that you need to be aware of when you're authenticating with third-party IDPs. Right? You may get very, very minimal information. And you might need more information. I mean, it might just be so you can customize the page and say, hello, John. You know, it's John that's logged on. It might be for that reason. But again, it's something to be aware of. And then if you're using Office 365, one of the ways of working with Office 365 is to use the Office 365 directory in the cloud, all right? And your users log in and authenticate against that directory. All right? But Microsoft need to know about your users. Right? So what can happen is you can synchronize into the directory. Right? So what you could have is you could have purely Office 365 users in the, well, it's the Azure Active Directory in the cloud. Right? And they've actually been created in that directory. Or what you can do is you can create your users down here and you can synchronize them to the directory. Now, you've got a couple of choices there. What we can do is you can have your users log in with an Azure identity, right? So they're actually logging in, supplying a username and credentials to Azure. Or you can decide that you want to use your on-premise ADFS to actually authenticate the users. So what's going to happen then is you supply the username, right? And what's going to happen is the Azure STS is going to say, aha, this user is a federated user. So actually, when we've replicated the users up, we also designate a domain as a federated domain. And anyone with, you know, john@xyz.com is xyz.com is designated a federated domain. It will say, aha, that user needs to authenticate against the STS in their company. And so we get a redirection down. So the question is, do you really need ADFS? Because if you look at using something like the Windows or Microsoft Azure Active Directory, we've got a management portal up there. It's very rich API set for adding users, deleting users, etc. So if you wanted to produce your own little web portal for managing it, you could do that very simply. You can get all sorts of hierarchical information out of there with the graph APIs. And what can you authenticate against? Well, pretty much anything you like, and you can also synchronize your users up there. So you could use it for managing your Azure subscription, for Office 365. It's obviously that's the directory that's used. Your applications. So you know when I said you want to deploy a claims-aware app and you've deployed it on premises, right? You can hook it up to Azure AD as your identity source, right? And you could also have this app in the cloud hooked up to Azure AD, which means you don't actually need ADFS on premises at all. In terms of there's application galleries, and there's also the ability of using partner apps through it. The application galleries is a whole raft of single sign-on applications, and they can do federation, these apps, but they can equally well, if it's a non-federated app. Microsoft have produced over 2,000 applications which now have single sign-on capability too. And basically what happens is you, against your Azure account, a username and password is set for that particular application you're going to. Question?
How does this work in the app scenario?
How does it work in the app scenario? in terms of if you're going for the app scenario, what you'll be using is OpenID Connect, which Azure supports very well, and you'd be using OAuth 2 as the actual authentication protocol. And yeah, with Azure that's fully enabled. With AD on premises, there's very limited. It does support OAuth 2, but it really supports OAuth 2 for things like workplace join and work folders at the moment. That support will get richer, but in terms of supporting the device protocols, right? If it's browser based, then it's not a problem. But if you want to go directly from the app, you need the ability to support things like OpenID Connect and also OAuth 2, and Azure does that beautifully. Right. And if you're looking at supporting apps, deploying apps to mobile devices, have a look at the mobile device services in Azure. Right. And it's all about synchronization, push, single sign-on. It's got the works in there. Okay, so on-premises ADFS and federation with AAD, what does it do for you? So here we've federated, so let's take the Office 365, we've federated down to here. What's it going to do? Well, we're going to hit up here, we're going to be redirected down to our local ADFS server, and what we can apply down at local ADFS server is we can detect whether you've come in from outside, from inside, because the proxy, make authorization decisions based on there. You've got all your own password policies. If you've got multi-factor authentication on your AD, you've got that. So basically, you are in total control of how that authentication works. You can also manage the workplace join and unregistered devices. So we can do all that. If you put ADFS on premise, you get all that. However, what it does, it means that you've got to deploy a high availability ADFS structure. And if your organization's big enough and there's enough people depending on it, you might want to geolocate this, all right? And in number one, it's quite expensive. Obviously, you need the servers and everything else to go with it. They can be virtualized these days. But even so, you've got to have the real estate to support it. And the other thing you need a high availability connection for your company's internet connection. And why I want to particularly mention that is you got the organization, okay, if the internet connection goes down, they can't go out and gain access to other resources. But let's say you've got an organization that has hundreds of home workers, all right? If they're not dependent on coming to your organization to authenticate, which is if you do federated SSO with Office 365 is going to happen, if your internet connection goes down, all your Office workers lose the capability of authenticating. Whereas if you actually did the authentication directly to the Azure Active Directory and didn't federate with on-premises, those home workers would be able to carry on working, authenticating, using the services up in the cloud, even if your company internet connection was down. So that's just something worth thinking about. So what are you really gaining is if you do federation with your own ADFS on premises, you've got the ability of controlling policies, using registered, unregistered devices, making authorization decisions, and so on. But the caveat of that is you need ADFS, you need ADFS proxy, it's got to be highly available, you need a highly available internet connection as well. So what should our architecture look like? Well, it should be farm-based, and what we need is we need the ADFS proxy, which is the web application proxy these days. ADFS is part of that. We will need to load balance to that, and then we will need to load balance to our ADFS farm, which will need a configuration database. Where does the configuration database come from for the proxy? The proxy actually uses the ADFS configuration database, and it polls it every 1 minute. So if you make a change, it will take a minute to propagate out to your, or potentially worst case, a minute to propagate to your proxies. Those proxies, they don't have to be domain joined unless you want to do Kerberos constrained delegation, in which case they must be domain joined. So then you've got the joy of having a domain joined device sitting in your DMZ or wherever you decide to sit it at that point. Okay. How does it actually pick up its configuration information, etc., if it's not domain joined? And it does that by when you do the install, what we'll see is we need to supply a username and password for a local administrator on the farm. And at that point, a self-signed certificate is generated by the proxy and deployed into the ADFS database. After that, authentication is just done with that certificate at all times. We don't need a username and password to be able to do and pick up information, write information into the database. It's the authentication is done through the certificate. The back end, what is that database? We'll need to come back to that. Your clients, if they're on the internet, want to hit the outside of the proxy farm to the VIP there. If they're internally, they want to go to the ADFS servers directly. So if you have got adfs.example.com on the internet, that needs to resolve to the public VIP. And if you're inside the corporate network, it needs to resolve to the private VIP of the ADFS farm. So you'll need to sort out DNS to do that. And what well, obviously when setting up the proxies, we'll need to make sure that the proxies, if they need to resolve adfs.example.com, they are going to resolve the internal address because they need to be able to talk to the actual ADFS farm. So that sort of pretty much covers the DNS requirements. However, there is another requirement that we'll need is for the device registration service. The device registration service is used for joining a device, workplace join. Okay? And when you workplace join, what you do is you type in the username that you want to use for workplace join. So john@example.com. What happens next is that a lookup will be done for enterprise registration.example.com. That lookup is done inside DNS. And what we need is to have in DNS that CNAMED, right, to the farm entry point. So if you're on the internet, that will be CNAMED to the front end of the proxies, and if you're internal, that will be CNAMED to the front end of your actual ADFS farm itself. So that's one compartment, and what you'll need to do is if you've got multiple domains inside your organization, so we can log in at john@example.com, harry@xyz.com, debbie@abc.com, then what we'll need is CNAMEs for all of those, all resolving enterprise registration dot whatever we'll need to resolve to adfs.example.com, right? And then what we'll need is on the certificate, we'll also need those enterprise registration names in there. And I will come back to that in 1 second. So in terms of installation prereqs, decide on the configuration database. What type? We'll need to come back to that. Install the SSL certificate. What are the requirements of that? It goes in the local computer store, but what else do we need to know about the cert? We need an account. And we can use a group managed service account. It's not exactly necessary, but it's a nice thing to have. If you use managed service accounts, pre-Server 2012 R2, those managed service accounts, what they would do, they could be used on one computer. Right? And the idea of a managed service account is that it automatically generates the password and automatically changes the password on the service account on a regular basis. All right. The problem is, if you've got a farm and you want to use the same managed service account across all members of the farm, you couldn't do it. Now you can, which is the group managed service account. We need Active Directory Windows 2008 or later, and we need to be the appropriate functional level, okay, which is the 2003 functional level or later. Hopefully you're already later on that. How many have got 2003 domains left? Anyone prepared to admit to it? So half a hand, I think, went up. So we need to, and if you want to be using workplace join, you need 2012 R2 schema, right? So you need, there's a device object that gets created in the AD, and we'll need the schema appropriately set for that. So we got two options for the configuration database. We can go for a WID database, which is the Windows internal database, or you can go for SQL. Right. The advantage of WID is it's distributed across multiple servers, right? And so therefore we've got the fault tolerance on it. So each farm member actually holds a copy. Only one copy is writable, right? And it's a maximum of 5 per farm. So if you want more than 5 federation servers, then you cannot use WID. You'd have to go for SQL. So our first server in the farm will be known as the primary server. It's the primary federation server, and it has the read-write copy of the WID database. If that guy dies, don't worry about it. You can't administer your ADFS farm anymore. But no problem, a little one line of PowerShell, and you can designate another server as being primary, and it takes over that primary role. And then as we bring in our additional servers, our secondary servers, they are read-only copies. And changes are updated every 5 minutes from the primary out to the secondaries. Now, in terms of, if you want to go SQL, fine. Then there's no restriction on the number of farm members. SQL has some other advantages as well. Problem is, you've got to make it fault tolerant, and you've got to manage all of that. At least with WID, you have the fault tolerance already. So if you're looking at SQL database, it's 2008 or newer. Say there's no theoretical limit on your farm size. It gives you additional functionality above WID. Number one, it does SAML artifact resolution, whatever that might be. When you pass with the SAML protocol, you can pass a token, right? So you go up to the security token service, it gives you back a token, take that token, and you present it to the application. So it can pass a token, or it can pass the token by reference. So if you're dealing with very big tokens, or you never want the token to go back to the client machine, you can pass it by reference. And the target system will use that reference to go and get the token from the ADFS server. You can only do that if the ADFS server has that token. And to have that token, it needs the artifact database, which comes with SQL. So we need SQL. It will also do replay detection as well, if you've got a SQL database. So we can actually have that in terms of the replay detection. The farm certificate is for our SSL communication. All our communication is going to be HTTPS, so it will use that for SSL comms. But it's also used now for the device registration service. All right? So we will have, for instance, sts.example.com. We could have a wildcard in there if we wanted. And then we'll need subject alternative names for all of those suffixes for the enterprise registration. Right? So they will need to be added in as subject alternative names. So recommendation is to use the same certificate for all nodes on the farm, and to use the same certificate on the WAP farm nodes as well. And highly recommended is to go and buy a public SSL cert. The problem is, if you don't, and you've got client devices outside of CorpNet, you've then got the issue of how do they pick up their certificate revocation lists, right? And you can say, okay, well, it's not a problem. I'll publish my certificate revocation list externally, and it all works beautifully. And then suddenly you say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we allowed partners in? And then partners, they would need your root certificate for your certificate. So best policy is just to use straight away is to use public certs. Spend the money and get those. The group managed service account, if you want to use it, you've got to do a little bit of work in the Active Directory. And you also need 2012 DCs. Right? You need a minimum of 2 of those to support it. I mean, you can get away with 1, but you need, really, for your fault tolerance, you need 2. And the idea of the group managed service account is that if we go back to the managed service account, what would happen is on the computer itself, the computer, when it re-registered its computer account into the Active Directory, changed the password on that, by default, it would also do it for a group managed service account, obviously using a different password. So it was the computer that generated the password. Well, that doesn't work in an environment where you've got multiple members of a farm. So they needed a different way of doing that. So the group managed service account is now maintained by the Key Distribution Service, or the KDS, and that runs on Windows Server 2012 domain controllers. And the password is actually calculated using a KDS root key, and you need to generate one of those guys, the current time, and there's a SID associated with the group managed service account. And how do we generate our first KDS root key? We use a bit of PowerShell to do that. Now, the challenge is that if you want to test this out in a dev environment, what will happen is you run the command Add-KdsRootkey-Effectivemmediately, and that's a bit of a lie because it's not effective immediately. You've triggered the process, but it's going to wait 10 hours before you can actually use it. The reason being it just has a 10-hour margin of safety to make sure that that's replicated everywhere. Right? What you can do is you can spoof it by actually overriding that by giving KDS root key effective time, and you can take the current time and you can add minus 10 hours. Right? So what actually happens, the effective time comes in now and it's seen as actually it's being created 10 hours earlier. So it can be used instantaneously. If you do that in a production environment, fine, but be aware that you could end up in trouble if it hasn't replicated. But if you've got really good replication, you could certainly cut it down from 10 hours to maybe an hour to give you a really good safety margin. So let's do a very quick demo of actually installing ADFS and just going through. I don't really want to see the install taking place, but I just want to really just go through the decision-making choices. So if we go across to my ADFS server, which is here, where do we get this thing from? Well, if you go to Manage, Add Roles and Features, and we come down here, let's just click on, and there it is, Active Directory Federation Services. So that's how you put the thing in the first place. I've already done it to save a bit of time. You get the post-install or post-deployment configuration, and here we go off to configure it. So the first thing you're faced with is create the first federation server in a farm, add a federation to a server to a farm. There is no, as I said before, no standalone option now. So next on there, and specify account with Active Directory domain administrator permissions to perform the configuration. Some of the configuration is done, particularly around the certificate area, is done into the AD, and we need AD permissions to be able to do that. Next on that, we need an SSL cert. I have an SSL cert. Let's have a look at that. And my SSL cert, if we come down under personal, is here. And if we look under details, under the subject alternative name, there's the subject, which is adfs.example.com. Subject alternative name down here, just take it up in size. what we've got is for ADFS, but we've also got for the enterprise registration as a subject alternative name in there. Okay, so that's the certificate. No, I don't want to save the changes. Next thing is to give it a display name. So we just go example, I don't know, example fed we'll do as a display name. Next on there. And then it's asking me for a group managed service account name. And we need to be able to create this. What it will need is it will need a KDS root key. If one doesn't exist, you'll actually be told that you need to create one. And then, you know, it will tell you the one which is the effective immediately, but then you have to go away for 10 hours and come back again. Well, if you like long coffee breaks, that's obviously the way to go. Otherwise, you do the spoof, which takes 10 hours off the time. So we'll call this ADFS, what should we call it? Farm SRV, how about that? Whoops, doesn't really matter what it's called. So next on there, if you don't want to use a group managed service account, then you can just use an ordinary account. That's fine. But then it's up to you to maintain it. Create a database or use SQL. You can put the SQL configuration string in there if you're using SQL. I'm going to use the WID database, the Windows internal database. View the script and come down here and do a next on there and tell it to configure. So it's done all the prereq things. Let's just view font. Let's just pump the font size up on there to make it a bit easier to see. So it's a really simple bit of PowerShell. So the certificate is identified by its thumbprint. Okay, we can go and get the thumbprint by actually looking at the certificate itself, or what we could do is actually run just a little bit of PowerShell. And if you do a get child item in here, and what we're looking for is the path of the certificate store, and come on, it should have picked it up. No, it's not doing it. Okay. Well, certificate store local machine my, and we'll just push that into a formatted list. Okay, and what it does, it just gives you a quick way of seeing all the certificates in your certificate store, and there's the thumbprint that you'll need to create this little PowerShell script. And there's the name of the name of the display name for my federated service, and also the farm account that I'm using. Okay, having run all that and finished that, what we can do is we can just look at the service account that's created, again using a bit of PowerShell, and so I don't have to waste my time typing it in. I've got this thing earlier. I thought, it's strange, I thought I'd increase the size of these fonts. Obviously didn't save it. So what we've got here is get ADFS service account, and what I'm asking for is the principal's allowed to retrieve password. So these are the servers that are allowed to retrieve this password, right? Because the KDS service is looking after them. So there's the principal's allowed to retrieve it, and then the service principal name. And let's just run that. And this is well worth remembering. Oops, what happened there? Because what the important thing is the service principal name in terms of Kerberos is actually registered against the account properly, which it is, so the ADFS has been registered against the account. And then principal's allowed to retrieve managed password. Every time you add a farm member, make sure that this is updated. I have seen in a couple of instances this not being properly updated, and so it all works beautifully until the point where you have to retrieve the password again, and then it can fail. So just do that check that it's working. Now, how do I know my ADFS server's working? Well, one of the best ways of doing that, if I could use the correct password, if I go across to pull the federation metadata, then and we'll need to look at that in compatibility view. So I've managed to pull federation metadata from my ADFS server. So ADFS server is certainly responding to federated metadata, but can it actually log me in? And I've got the ability here. Let's look at the properties of that. Let's just grab that, pop that into Notepad. And what we can do is we can initiate an IDP-initiated sign-on as by way of testing. So I can actually come in now and do that, and it takes me to the Federation server, says, would you like me to sign you in? And we're signed in. Okay, and then you can sign out again. And if you can get Federation metadata, if you can sign in, it's almost invariably working. I've never actually found a Federation farm that isn't working after you've done that test. The next thing is to obviously set up all the rules, etc., within the ADFS configuration to talk to your relying parties. Okay, so let's just go back to the slide deck. Customization. Very easy to customize things. I put a link in there to that gives you a location for finding out about customization. The simple customization you can do just by putting in additional information into a file. You can do complete customization if you want to use the ADFS SDK, so the software development kit. In terms of the web application proxy, we sort of discussed this earlier. It sits here, and it acts as a proxy to the ADFS server, but it also allows you to publish out through it. And if you remember, I mentioned that you can publish with sort of pass-through, so we can go straight to a web app, or we can do authentication at the edge. And that authentication at the edge, so you don't even get through the proxy until you've authenticated. So WAP requirements, you can do it with one network card if you want, or you can put 2 network cards in if you prefer. In some scenarios, you might use DirectAccess and or VPN, and they can be supported on the same server. The strange thing is, where do you find the ADFS proxy? It's under the remote access role. All right, so remote access is about direct access, about VPN. It's part of that role. You install the ADFS SSL cert on the WAP node, and the certificate is going to be required for each published application, because at the moment the WAP will only allow HTTPS coming into it. That might well change in the future. And to use Kerberos constrained delegation, where we're coming in with claims and going through to a Windows identity, you must be domain joined. Otherwise, the WAP does not need to be domain joined. So in terms of installing it, it really couldn't be easier. Where are we? We've got to find the thing first. Does that look like a proxy? Yes, it does. Okay, so where do we, in terms of we do add roles and features, if we come down here, and you look for it, and you go through, it's not Federation Services, and you look and think, where on earth is it? It's remote access. So that's where you put it in, okay? So it goes in under there, and then you have the post-deployment configuration, and what we need to do is we need to supply the Federation service name, which is adfs.example.com, and this must resolve in DNS to your internal ADFS farm. The username, we need actually a username which is going to work on our ADFS. So actually, yeah, that's a very good question. Is what did I use in there? I'm going to use ADFS 1 administrator. This is sort of like one-time usage, okay? And I'll explain that while it's cooking in a second. So adfs.example.com for the certificate. PowerShell's available there, and then it configures. And as I say, why did I supply that username and password? It's so that the proxy can access the database for the ADFS farm so that it can put its certificate into that database. Right? So now, forevermore, it will use certificate authentication. And obviously, it will renew the certificate, and it will renew it in advance of the other one actually expiring. So there we are. That's installed. How do we test it? Again, what we can do now is if I take my client and push my client out onto the internet, so my client goes onto the internet, okay, let's just take that up full screen, and let's close that. Okay, so can we get Federation metadata? Yes, we can. All right, and we're doing this from the internet now. Can we do a single sign-on, IDP initiated? So it says we need to sign in. And so example, John. And just get the password right. And we're now coming in through the proxy. So you're now in a situation where actually you've got the infrastructure installed, all right, and you're ready to start sort of configuring relying parties and relationships with other claims providers and everything else. But your infrastructure is there. How do we add another farm member? Well, you just saw it in terms of the ADFS. You just add it in as an additional farm member. How do we add an additional proxy? It's just one install for each proxy. It just looks the same. You don't have to say you're putting in an additional proxy. So that there are multiple proxies that go in, and they're all going to put their own certificates across into the ADFS farm configuration store. Okay, let's just go back. And in terms of load balancing and firewall settings, you can use NLB if you want to. If you decide you're going to deploy this thing onto a domain controller, you can't use NLB. I wouldn't recommend putting it on domain controller except in a test environment. And if you do, you can't use, as I say, can't use NLB. In terms of firewalls, you will need to enable SSL, and you will need to enable 49443 if you're using certificates, okay? And that's for certificate authentication. So if you decide you're going to authenticate from the client using certificate authentication, you will need to open that other port. And if you decide that you're using Kerberos constrained delegation between your proxy and your domain controller, you will have to go through all the excitement of allowing the ports for this guy to remain a domain member, the proxy. And you'll have to evaluate the risk. I mean, the advantage is you can support Windows auth apps. The risk is you are domain joined with your proxy. So in this very short 1 hour session, what we did is really take you through what you get out of Server 2012, R2 ADFS, reasons for deploying, and in particular what I'd like you to remember and take away is the question, do I really need to deploy ADFS on premises? Or should I be looking at reaching out more to the future and maybe embracing Azure AD as my way forward in terms of providing federated identity? And then we just went through the 2 installs of the main server and also the proxy. And anytime you like, I love coming to Norway, so I'm always available for consultancy. So by all means, contact me. And I'm doing one more session today, which is the last session of the day on ADFS troubleshooting and troubleshooting the web application proxy as well. So if you fancy coming back on that, I'd love to see you. Otherwise, I will see you maybe next year. And thanks for coming to this session. If you've got any questions, by all means, answer them down the front.